So good evening, everybody. As an introduction, my name is John Britton. I am British by birth, so I'll give you a moment or two to acclimatize to my accent. And today I'm going to be talking about predictive and mitigating technologies, specifically in the cybersecurity domain, obviously that being my expertise. So obviously the focus of today is to kind of give you an understanding of what technology is out there, some of the thought processes around how it should be deployed, and obviously the threats and stuff that we're having to deal with from a day-to-day perspective to enable you guys to leave this meeting and go have the correct conversations about being able to protect yourselves going forward. So without further ado, so I'm going to do a little bit more of an introduction to kind of sell myself so you understand the kind of background that I'm coming from, so you can get with the mindset. I'll do an introduction to Corvid Cyberdefense, the company that I work for. I'm going to go into today's business. A bit rough and ready because today's business is about 4 weeks old in comparison to what it was, a month or two ago. I'll start talking on threats, and then I'm going to go really into the security technology. So hopefully you enjoy it, and obviously I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end. So I started my journey within cybersecurity back in 2000.
Heads up, John, we're only seeing the PowerPoint preview screen. We're not seeing the presentation, correct?
Okay.
The slides aren't stopping me. I got you.
Let's see. Technology, eh?
Yeah, right.
What about that?
Perfect. We've got you. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So I started my journey in information security, shall I say, realistically, in 2005 when I joined the British Army. I started working within electronic warfare, back then known as Special Operations Signal Intelligence. And I went through my career and ultimately ended in about 2015 within the Special Forces, where I was an electronic warfare signals intelligence analyst, I guess, although realistically a soldier. And I spent the good 10 years, going from everything from Cold War interceptions all the way through to, 3 tours of Afghan and a couple of others here and there, where we're doing sort of like low-end communication interceptions and stuff like that. So I got a great understanding of an early age. I joined the Army at 17, and I got an understanding of how hard technology used to be and how manual it was. So emphasis on today, I've seen the whole development from technology built from the 80s into what today has to be for the agile environment that we work in. I left the British Army Special Forces in 2015 and emigrated over here, where I started working for Wells Fargo, and I was the lead for the Cyber Threat Fusion Center. And there we were doing the 24/7 security operations for the internal infrastructure for one of the biggest banks in America. So obviously I've gone from being agile on the front line of Afghanistan to now being in the biggest environment in America for enterprise level security. So again, I now got a new insight into different technologies and different arenas of how security is led. And one of the things that obviously from an enterprise level, it kind of emphasized for me how slow things can go and how hard manipulation and change to the exact threat that we're having to defend against today can be complex, and how preventative and mitigative technologies is extremely important. In 2017, I joined Corvid Cyberdefense, where I'm now the Director of Security Operations. I'll kind of get into their slide. And for Corvid Cyberdefense, what we went to the market with, we're about 5 years old, and we saw a huge gap within the arena of cybersecurity for the small, medium businesses in how they would be supported and how they would be able to provide themselves with a security platform as strong as something like Wells Fargo, but at the budget of something that's, next to nothing. So gratefully, we had nothing to back up with, but we were able to develop a solution that provided an end-to-end cybersecurity platform for the small to medium enterprise level company that would get them down all routes of compliance and security, and obviously be agile enough, utilizing predictive and mitigative technologies to be enabled to be secure and obviously, going well and touch wood, not get hacked. So that kind of brings me on to the challenges that these companies have to defend against today, and hopefully, not too many of the people on this call are being challenged by them. But overall, the biggest question that I'm being asked, or I'm asking the people that we're supporting, is what drove digital transformation within your company? And for the most part, if they're lucky, it may have been the CEO, it may have been the CTO, it could have been the board of directors, it could have been a few people within the organization. But 9 times out of 10, the companies that I'm having to deal with, unfortunately, are having digital transformation based on the fact that there's cyber attacks that have enabled them or have disabled them. So they've had to, rethink everything. Or as we all know, in the last 4 weeks, unfortunately, we've all had to adapt to this new way of living. And obviously that's working from home, kids downstairs screaming, and everybody's now connected, but there's still opportunities now that have been created that we have to respond to accordingly to enable companies to be safe. So the traditional methodology in which companies were securing themselves were they would have a centralized business, office, multiple floors, and everybody connected either through direct connection or through the Wi-Fi, and that would quite happily sit behind a firewall. And, to a certain extent, certain people were given permission to work from home. But, 4 or 5 weeks ago, that all changed. And today, our presence in the office, I've left a small smidge of a presence, mostly because we have a couple of companies who, some of the older boys actually don't have internet at home, so they still have to go into the office. But for the most part, 90% of the businesses now are all operating from home. So this has opened up a new arena of security threats. So there are obviously a lot of operational considerations, and now that the technology that we'll talk about in a moment is going to come heavily in play for. So some of the considerations now that the operations arena has changed is, are you set up on these 3 main areas, like a VPN connection? Most companies that we support, have obviously opportunity to have the VPN connection. But when we first went into their environments and configured the firewalls and put everything in place for the end-to-end solution, we never had to actually configure a VPN because nobody worked from home. So we had to, 3 weeks ago, scramble to get everybody onto the VPN connection and to go through all that parameters of actually teaching people what the VPN connection does and very quickly, operationalize them securely, safely, and obviously in a healthy manner. So obviously now everybody could connect back to the business. And obviously, it now means that they have 2 means of connection of whether they're going to go into the business to connect to some critical infrastructure that they need, or if it's just to have the firewall protection that they need because most of the operations that they do are online. Another consideration that a lot of our users had, they obviously not for our arena, sorry, but for a lot of the companies that we're obviously dealing with now, they use a traditional methodology of how antivirus is managed. So they have a signature-based detection, which requires constant updates. And because now the people are working from home, and because 4 weeks ago that was such a small niche area, and they were coming once a week, that was sufficient enough that the endpoint agent was able to then be able to update periodically and be able to update all the signatures. But nowadays, because people are constantly working from home, we've had to go through this methodology and working out how do well, obviously we don't because our signature tool doesn't work like that, but they've had to go through the methodology to work out how do we now get the connection to come back through the VPN so our agents on the endpoints can be appropriately updated without the end users sitting there vulnerable because, we don't have an end date for when this is going to end. And then the last piece, as we all know, and obviously we're all using Zoom today, communications has been you can chit chat, you can phone them, you can email them, but now it's become extremely important for organizations to be able to on the fly talk to one another. And as we've seen, because now communications have become such a pertinent requirement in the environments that we're supporting, they've now become the target of multiple hacks. And as we know, Zoom did become vulnerable. So For those of you at home using Zoom and have the application on, please obviously make sure that you've updated it to the latest agent. And if you do have any accounts, obviously please change the credentials linked with that, because again, there have been data breaches. But obviously the main area of this is we've gone from a environment in which we're in the office all day. Now we're at home all day. You know, there's more considerations and there's a different arena that we have to support. So it becomes very important to have the right tools in place so you don't have to put too much consideration into this. So what does that also, what additional pieces to that? So we just talked about like the VPN connection back to the home base, to the firewall to make sure that people are secure. The first model that we spoke about when people were working from the office, that was fine. A lot of the older companies that we had to deal with that, they've set up their ISP connection to the internet years ago. They've never had any problems, but they've only got like 10 megs worth of connection speed, which is fine when everyone's working in the office. But unfortunately now, this has now left us in an arena where the 100 people that were working in the office and were working fine are now all working from home and having to now route back into the actual office to get onto the firewall, to then be able to get out to the internet, to be able to do the work, to be able to download and do the normal activities. So this is now, you know, impacting the businesses because they've never had to think of the disaster recovery of having, you know, 100 meg connection because 10 megs has worked for the last 10 years. Additionally, some of the firewalls out there aren't configured in a way that they will enable large volumes of VPN connections. So for some of our larger companies, we had to upgrade them to a higher capability, which would allow 2,000, 3,000 VPN connections, whereas originally we were only on a 500 VPN connection because, again, it didn't exist in the environment. So, you know, we're having to operationalize different considerations. The other piece to it is on some of the older technologies out there, and this will kind of all come into fruition in a moment, the non-suitable for work activities like streaming, music and stuff like that, is very high consumption of bandwidth. And, you know, I stream music most days. You know, I'm kind of in that analytical methodology where I'm always looking at data. So having music in the background really helps me. But obviously, in this arena where I'm having to actually route into my into the office and then out to the internet, me listen to music on my work computer doesn't go down well because it's then 10% of the bandwidth. And then if everybody does it, the work-orientated operations get impacted. So these are considerations just on the bandwidth that we've had to adopt based on technology to enable us. And it all comes and is driven from the policies that we can set. So in the office working, I would go to the clients and say, what are your considerations on Facebook, Netflix, YouTube? And for the most part, the office managers will be like, I'm not too fussed because I can walk around the office and see when people are doing this. You know, you all know this is a fake background. I'm working from home. I've got 3 monitors in front of me. We've got a spare laptop to the left of me. It doesn't stop me from being able to remote in and actually just watch movies all day and work because, you know I can do that and I can maintain the work. But from a physical perspective of the firewall actually working, it doesn't compute. So now we've had to adopt these new methodologies in how the policies of work from home have to be somewhat stricter. And thankfully, everybody are understanding thus far. You know, they understand the fact that we've had to block things like YouTube and stuff like that. But thankfully for them, again, utilizing the right technologies, we're enabling ourselves to be able to preemptively prevent failure. So the correct VPN setting, we're utilizing the right technology, and obviously the preventative state and the mitigating state of this firewall is the fact that we're now preventing ourselves from having a complete business failure because everybody is actually streaming music. So this example in front of you, you've got obviously from the left-hand side is the person working from home. They need to access the internet for certain reasons, and they've also got business critical servers that they need to get to, file shares and stuff like that. So for the top arrow, they've connected through the VPN, they've gone through the firewall, and they're obviously enabled to get into the actual business critical servers. That's obviously called, and then this next premise is called split tunneling, where we're then able to operationalize the business need versus obviously the proxy needs, where we're then able to identify, you know, them going to the generic internet, Google, and stuff like that can still be routed through the firewall and out to the internet. So therefore, the user's activities are safe. They are monitored and they are protected. And therefore, we are mitigating any threats that obviously do come into the arena by obviously making sure that they are protected. But then at the same time, because we've got an advanced next generation firewall with the right agents on the endpoints and the firewalls running it, we're able to do a third split tunneling where we can predetermine YouTube, Netflix, and things like that that do not touch the VPN. So these would go directly out to the internet from the local ISP at the house. So that obviously constrains the end user, but it doesn't impact the business. So, you know, I'll get into a little bit more of the firewall from a security perspective, obviously me being a cybersecurity person, but from a disaster recovery and a business aspect, these are the kind of threats that we have to make sure that we're considering at all points, because nobody saw that this was going to be a big work from home for the next 4 to 8 weeks. But obviously utilizing the right technologies in your environments, you've already mitigated a lot of threats, which for the company that's using 10 gigs, they're still using 10 gigs because we've been able to implement this kind of policy and structure in their data flow and how they operationalize themselves. So that's just kind of like a bit of an inkling into it. The next premise, obviously, I'd like to talk about the threat. This landscape has completely changed. I have seen a day and night difference between pre-corona versus post-corona for the 100+ clients that we're serving. Network, IDS, IPS, vulnerability scans from foreign countries don't happen anymore. They do, obviously, but obviously there's a lot of infrastructure which were in the businesses that don't exist anymore. So physically trying to connect and to attack people isn't something of high priority because it's just not available for them at the moment. However, because people are working from home now, they've had their protective bubble taken away from them. So we've seen a huge increase in phishing attacks to the clients that we're supporting. Thankfully, obviously, again, we're a security operation, so we're able to be proactive on that. But the piece that I'm obviously concerned on is the fact that when Susie in finance was recipient of an email that looks fishy, she could turn around and ask Dave, and Dave was like, yeah, I don't agree to that. Let's escalate it to the IT team. But now, obviously, the IT team, obviously, she has not got Dave to ask. She's not got the capabilities of being able to ask the IT team straight up because they're currently scrambling to make sure that everyone's VPN connections are working. So she's kind of cognizant of that, and she's like, oh, well, I'll just try to see if it is legitimate or not. Then she clicks on the link, and obviously she's none the wiser, and she loses her credentials. So the security bubble has changed. The end user with no protection, obviously we've ingested a stack of companies that just didn't have anything, and their endpoints weren't protected in the way that a traditional, a next generation machine learning agent would do, because they're still using the old-fashioned signature-based daily update kind of signature-based AV, and also they're obviously not got a VPN connection because they didn't need that 4 weeks ago. So we've seen a lot of people's security just completely disappear, and obviously we've had to go in with the new clients and fix them, or for some of the existing ones, make sure that the VPN connection is fully working for them because obviously it wasn't prior needed. And then the fast one is, you know, now everybody's adapted to new communication platforms. Obviously, some clients didn't have Zoom, some do now. Some are utilizing instant messaging technology. They've gone and bought Dropbox, Box, file share systems, and they've potentially not implemented them correctly, or they've utilized like the same credentials and they've gone at it very quickly. So all of a sudden their scope of the business was, you know, there was a file share system on the in the environment behind a firewall, had routing rules and everything protected on it. But now they've gone into the cloud because they need to agilely make sure that the business is working. So that whole arena has changed. I always like to go through my presentations with a bit of demo of explaining, you know, the types of threats that we do see in the environments. And obviously the most traditional, as I said, is phishing. The scenario base for this particular one from left to right is, you know, an email gets sent through, and then on the right-hand side, unfortunately, the hacker gets a backdoor and is able to manipulate things. But obviously, one of the things that we like to implement is a defense in depth, because with the agility of the arena is constantly changing, you're not always guaranteed to have every single security parameter that is available. So this next, obviously, explanation will give you that kind of parameters that if you do have a signature-based system that obviously needs to go and update once a week, you know you've got certain security practices hidden behind it or in front of it that's hopefully going to eliminate some threats before they get to you. Or in certain cases, if you've not got a VPN, you've got email security or endpoint security. So in this particular case, from the left-hand-most side, an email has been delivered. The first parameter from a security perspective is to have an email security gateway. These are some big players out there, Proofpoint, Barracuda, and Mimecast. And ultimately, we're able to preemptively create policies in these that are going to eliminate tons of threats. But one of the biggest problems that we do see in the environment, and especially today, the biggest threats that we're seeing are actual social engineering attacks. And to a certain extent, these are hard to detect. Most of them are orientated around a random Gmail account pretending to be the CEO. And obviously, we can create policies to prevent that. But if you create for the CEO and also they identify that then they use the CFO and you've not done that one, it can go through to the end user. So the next premise is obviously with the end users or the people in the organizations being the weakest links, we have to conduct continuous training. And obviously with the bubble being popped at the moment of how people are operationalizing themselves out of the home base, and they've not got the people next to them to ask questions and the IT team are a little bit overworked. The parameters around having continuous training around phishing campaigns and also awareness videos is critical because that then gives them the capabilities and the understanding to go, okay, I really don't think this is right. This is how I communicate to my IT team. And one of the other premises of the communications and training is training people in this new arena. How do you communicate with your IT team? Because Dave may have known, but Susie doesn't, and Susie needs to have that capability at her hand, at a beck and call to be able to respond to something, in a more EDR kind of response role. But ultimately, with that training, it's going to eliminate the time that it takes an IT professional to get to it, thus preventing or reducing the impact. The next parameter, as we've kind of spoken about, is obviously the next generation firewall in the environment. The parameters of how that's rolled out has definitely changed. We've got now cloud-based, and we've also got physical-based clients that are utilizing a hybrid kind of solution. But by having a firewall, a next-generation firewall specifically, enables us, if Susie, in this example, was to get an email that does go through, there's a bit of social engineering back and forth from the so-called CEO. And the CEO kind of goes, okay, look, we can't meet up, we've got no timings. How about I just send you the document, you review it, and let me know what your thoughts are. Susie's trying to be a good person. She's like, yep, let's do it. She's gone into the URL that has a link. That's obviously then taken her to the internet, which once it's gone to the website that she's been hoaxed to go to, that unbeknown to herself has started to download something. And within the firewalls, and we'll get into it a little bit more specifics, each three of them arenas are capable of being detected upon. But ultimately, in this scenario, they were not. So we rely on the most critical piece of the environment, and that's the antivirus that lays on the endpoint. Again, I've said several times that there's a lot of difficulties with signature-based technologies, especially when it comes down to 0 days. So in this particular case, unfortunately for this young lady, she was not able to have her endpoint technology be able to detect and prevent this attack. And ultimately, that's then led to the hacker being able to gain a backdoor access into the environment, and ultimately then be able to manipulate and do whatever it wants. So for us, from a protective point of view, there's obviously a terminology called threat hunting, which ties in quite nicely with the previous conversation where we're talking about data aggregation, but ultimately having that machine learning and that system in place to be able to detect these anomalies ultimately enables you in a defense in depth, regardless of where the detection is. If it's on the threat hunting that we detect, Russian traffic or something like that, we can then pinpoint it back to the endpoint. We can then see anomalies conducted and then be able to go, okay, well, how did they get there? Then go back into the network, and from the network say, well, how did that get through there? And ultimately patch and fix every single step. But, the whole premise of this conversation is talk about predictive and mitigative technologies. So with that, let's start doing that. the email gateways, obviously one of the biggest arenas in the environments of security at the moment. It's the number one type 1 attack. And I say type 1 because most of the attacks are trying to set up the baseline of a larger attack. It may be that they're just trying to socially engineer you to get information from you, and it leads to a business email compromise. Or it could be something that is going to lead to you going to a website like the scenario I've just spoke about. A lot of the clients that we speak to on the initial gateway, when we're obviously onboarding them, we ask them, do you have a security tool for your email? And they tell me, yeah, I have a spam filter. It's not the same thing. The two different spam filters are detecting trend analysis around images, around sales links, stuff like that, where it is truly spam, things that you don't want to see. But a true email security gateway, that of Proofpoint, Barracuda, or Mimecast, which is the tool that I'm talking about today, they have the capabilities of preemptively be able to create policies in the technology that prevent anti-spoofing and anti-impersonation, where I may be trying to spoof your domain, or I'm trying to create my company is called Corvid Cyberdefense. I can sure you all can sympathize that these last couple of weeks we have struggled with COVID. We've been blocked ultimately quite a few times where people have been like, nope, I don't want anything to do with COVID. And I was even, no, we're Corvid, and that's unfortunate that we're having to deal with. But that's a kind of scenario base where Corvid and COVID is so similar, but it's so easy to misinterpret. So if you don't have the right technology in place, that kind of email would slip through. And if it was somebody at johnbritton@covid.com trying to manipulate you, obviously they're going to obviously be able to get it a little bit better because the similarities are so close. Attachment management and sandboxing. There's a lot of things around emails that if you were to do the analysis of the types of files that are sent through your environment, you'll probably find that there's probably less than 10. So because of that, you can start creating an understanding of how the environment has been configured and how it's set up and how people work to be able to say, well, executables, DLLs, PowerShell scripts, anything along that lines, they shouldn't be sent through. Because the most part, if it's outside of Office, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, PDFs, text files, and stuff like that, there's probably not many other file types that are sent. And then if there are, you're obviously able to create the policies in the environment to be able to detect and understand how the routing of that technology or that type of traffic should be done. And then the sandboxing parameter of that is having every attachment sandbox, which the idea of sandboxing is you open up the file in a safe area. So then if it is bad, you can just fix it and flatten the sand and start again. But if anything is to be acknowledged or identified as being a malicious attack or attachment, sandboxing is the only way for you to detect that, because for the most part, a lot of these spam filters may be able to detect a URL in the email, but most of the time it's a PDF saying read the email and click on the link in the attachment and you'll find it. So obviously sandboxing enables us to detect that, as well as malware and stuff like that getting sent through the email. DKIM, SPS, and DMARC, these are other parameters that have been around for years that enable you to be able to close off your environment from people being able to spoof your environment or stand up a server out in Africa pretending to be whatever company you are. And obviously it comes into the environment, but the IP doesn't match because the FPF record states that it should be X. So if you have a security gateway, you're able to preemptively detect that types of things. Malware protection speaks for itself. We don't want malware going through the email. And then URL management, this is again is one of the biggest arenas or areas where emails are obviously trying to manipulate you by taking you away from the email gateway and onto the network so then they can get you to download things. So the reason why we need to use like email gateways, again, from a predictive and mitigative, I've not actually started to speak about anything sophisticated yet, other than implementing technology that will ultimately allow you to baseline how the organization works and to preemptively mitigate things that shouldn't be sent. So obviously, impersonations and anti-spoofing, I can probably say quite comfortably in the last 6 months, I've had 15 companies join us after being hit by an impersonation and spoofing attack, and it's cost them upwards of $1 million collectively based on just simple business email compromises, being able to understand how they did. But if they had the anti-impersonation and spoofing in place, them emails would never have been able to get into the environments. So obviously, again, the mitigative and predictive is understanding the traffic in your environment and creating the correct policies to mitigate open doors. Obviously, the spoofing and impersonation, as I said, like this is a good example where the Corvid, you know, the two very similar, they can be spoofed. The impersonation, we see this a lot, where day in, day out, Gmail accounts are attempting to be my CEO, but I know my CEO's personal email, I know his 5 business emails, so if an email comes in from him that doesn't come from there, it doesn't come in. So therefore, I preemptively mitigated a threat. The next arena, as going with the scenario that I previously was talking about, is obviously next generation firewalls. This is very much the glue of every environment that we support. You know, they all have a network environment. They all have some sort of connection to the internet. Next generation firewalls are obviously very pertinent because initially we'd have, when firewalls started to begin, they were kind of switches. They just did mail routing. That's really all they did. Sorry, traffic routing. That's all really they could do. Then we had a IDS system, which is a incident detection system, which basically would detect anomalies, threats based on signatures. And then we had the prevention, where then you could actually create rules and anomalies, again, in the same manner as we did from the email perspective. But in this particular case, obviously, it's looking specifically at network flow of how, you know, applications should be running, how subnets to the internet or, you know, critical areas within your infrastructure should not be communicated with, but you could then create the policies. But with the next generation firewall, obviously, you still do have the traffic routing and the management perspective. But you also then get a lot more to it. So you're able to lock down things from an application point of view, because as the layer 3, 4, and 5 were dependent pieces of the traditional networking, a lot of things now are working on the layer 7 of the application, where we can see when end users are particularly using like Dropbox or Box, or they're using FileShare, OneDrive, they're utilizing certain types of remote management tools where people can remote into machines, you know, MyLogon, Zoom, stuff like that, where if we can preemptively understand what should be running in the environment, we can already mitigate that types of applications and lock down certain use groups. Or one of the other uses that we do have is marketing teams now need to gain access to like Facebook and stuff like Twitter and stuff like that, but other teams don't. So we can create that kind of policy to prevent that type of access for people based on category management and also utilizing AD synchronization to enable a preventative policy that will allow management from the IT perspective, but also creating business units to have certain access to certain sites, technologies, applications, thus reducing the risk of opening up certain vulnerabilities like Zoom. If we needed to lock that down, we can do it from a security perspective versus having to actually go manually lock everything else down. One of the other premises, obviously, malware prevention, malware detection, and sandboxing has now heavily been pushed into the network side because file uploads and downloads are happening every second, and it's obviously become very critical to be able to identify these. So they're very much on a signature base, but they are updated constantly, and obviously are able to sandbox some of the files that nobody knows what they are, DLLs, PDFs, and all that kind of information and files that are getting downloaded. But obviously from this perspective, they're doing it at a more aggressive rate because, as we said, for the email piece, there may be 10 types of files that are sent, but from a network side, there are hundreds, thousands, if not, that are sent constantly throughout the day from a, you know, it's needed from a network where we're sending certifications all the way to people, again, utilizing Excel, Word, PowerShell scripts and stuff like that. And then the final piece, and this is kind of the mitigative technology coming into the firewall, is that they have Threat Detective, which is threat hunting, and we're able to ingest predetermined libraries of additional information, whether it be IPs of known bad hackers, URLs of new websites that are hosting certain things, or geographical information that has enabled us to identify, you know, China's been on an uptick, so you need to be looking out for this. And all in all, this accumulates to us to be able to create a prerequisite, to create an environment from the network side that ultimately is quite hardened from a security perspective, but it allows the whole business operations to run seamlessly. Now, there are obviously prerequisites to this. When the firewalls are put into place, they need to be built correctly. And this is not something that can be done overnight. It does take a good couple of weeks to be able to really understand how the environment needs to be done. If you have a bit of traffic that you create, you then need to split it. And then you may need to split it again, and you keep splitting it up until the point that you have got a flow of traffic that you can truly understand. And if there was anything to be identified that need changed, obviously you can jump onto that singularity versus having to jump quite high upstream, change something, and risk the idea of breaking something from the business. But then the next emphasis on this is because it takes a little bit of time to build correctly, you then have to manage it appropriately. And that's constant. Obviously, that's one of the reasons why, from our perspective, when we come into an environment, we don't just put the technology in and let you guys maintain it. We make sure that we manage our own technology because it is a continuous thing that we have to keep going through. And then, as I said, with the new generation, the next generation of firewalls, we have to go through a lot of the preemptive, obviously the IDS and the IPS. So then the next pieces that we do have, obviously, are the endpoint. And I'm going to speed up a little bit because I've just gone over a little bit of time. The endpoint agents is obviously now one of the critical aspects of the environments that we do need to get into. And ultimately, the traditional methodologies were to use signature-based. But as we know how things are going, it's not obviously the case that we can do that anymore. So what we're starting to look at is machine learning agents. So the two comparisons are on the left-hand side, the traditional base for the 10 examples provided. These are known malwares that I've seen in our environment in the last 10 days. But if I don't update my database on a traditional methodology and these came in, they'll be identified as 0 days and things that we just can't manage. Whereas obviously the machine learning mechanism obviously now enables us to be able to detect these anomalies in a slightly different method where the machine doesn't need to know the hash. It can actually detect and obviously go through the anomalies and see how the variability of these new files operate and have a confidence rating of 80% to be able to say, okay, I believe that this is malware, and then be able to preemptively allow us to block it before it actually gets anywhere. Now, apologies because I am obviously running through out of time a little bit, but obviously, all in all, with all these technologies, this is where it's right actually kind of it compensates quite well into the last briefing where we talk about aggregating all this data together. And that's how we do that through SIM technology, and utilizing obviously everything to go into one place enables us to be able to create filters and then obviously alert on said filters, which obviously in a preventative measure enables us to be able to, somewhat detect things, but because we're looking at anomalies from a larger perspective, you may have detected it on the endpoint, but now you can go back and see how it flew through the email and through the endpoint from a single panel, because the traditional methodology in larger organizations was this is done through individual teams that never spoke. But now by utilizing SIM technology, you have all this data in one place, which enables you to obviously create a correspondence. And obviously this is how my team work. We look in the SIM and have this data filled and go through each anomaly to be able to communicate, correlate, and obviously alert on these detections and create further hardening in the environments to prevent any threats that are obviously coming into the environment. Which obviously we covered in this scenario, the reverse engineering of this, we can go to any point of the detection, reverse engineer it in the SIM to be able to allow us to detect where it came from and block for future attacks. But that only works from having the preventative rules in place for the whole defense in depth mechanism. And then obviously the next step, which I was going to get to, is then having the machine learning of these smaller anomalies to be automated. If you've seen anomalies coming in from a single IP that are scanning multiple ports in your environment, because the firewall can detect that, you can create rule logic in automation through the SIM to actually preemptively put blocks in place from the firewall perspective. So you're not having to rely on a human to engage from the SOC. And then ultimately, that will then come to the Security Operations Center to create this best prevention posture where you have the defense in-depth posture in the environment for the technology all in sync with one another. It has a preventative posture where it's understanding of the environment. It has the right policies locked down. All that then feeds into a single source, which is the SIM technology that is then filtered based on predetermined rules or OS, open source intelligence That then goes into alerting, which then follows through to automation through PowerShell, macro scripts, and obviously things that are on the right technology, and then are correspondingly monitored by security operations 24/7 and have that mitigation. So if you do have anything that happens, because of the right technology in place, you're able to backtrack it throughout all technologies and harden the environment. So the predictive and mitigative technology isn't just a single agent that sits on the endpoint. Unfortunately, it's a mechanism of multiple technologies that sit around the environment to be able to allow this kind of defense in depth preventive posture. Whew, sorry about that. I had to rush that last bit just to allow for the next speaker. So thank you, obviously, everybody, for participating in this briefing. If you do have any questions, please feel free. And obviously, good luck.